the chat going on here. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. If you are going to join us, we have 0 right now, but hopefully they will come in soon.
I'll tweet it out too.
Yeah. I am Pops and File, otherwise known as the Right Geek, and I am here tonight with #1 Marmaduke fan, and we are going to talk a little bit about social justice, academic social justice, academic feminism, and both of their impacts on comics. #1 Marmaduke fan, I got interested in his channel because, well, I like the bigger channels too. I think they're very funny, and I like listening to him. The unique thing that I think #1 Marmaduke fan is doing is he's actually going into the, hey, this is where it's coming from. And I think it's important to talk about where that ideology is coming from, what is its ultimate source, and what that's going to mean if we let that get footholds into our popular culture. So #1 Marmaduke fan, he went to an art school at an undisclosed location in the Midwest. So would you like to talk about that experience?
Sure thing, and thank you for having me on. Well, I guess I'd say I just started, like most kids, I was just drawing a lot. I was really interested in doing it, and I spent a little time learning kind of traditional arts from kind of like a small school. It wasn't the SJW University, but I spent some time at a small school learning kind of like basics of traditional art. And while I was there, I learned a little bit about, kind of avant-garde postmodern art because they taught you, history. So you'd learn about those movements. And I experimented that in a little bit, but I would say I was mostly a traditional artist. I wanted to be a art teacher. So I looked into a school where I could get like a really good, art history credential. And the one I got accepted to had a much more progressive view of art. I'd say they were much more interested in being avant-garde and being at the cutting edge, and that's where I started getting really absorbed into what I'd call maybe like the postmodern academic feminist worldview as related to making art and art history. And I do think that was the dominant view, where every professor was either a feminist themselves or they were kind of like a moderate. It was moderate left to far left was the intellectual diversity in that environment.
We have everyone from Democrats to communists to super communists. Yeah.
I distinctly remember one of my professors who did a class on like queer theory, saying my heart wants to vote for Bernie, but my head wants to vote for Hillary. That was the big moral quandary for most of my professors.
So when you were going through our school and coming into contact with these theories in academia, what were the principal features of those theories that you observed? What were the themes that came up over and over again?
Sure. I think postmodernism is important. The death of the author, the death of an objective truth, and I think they need to start with that, because if you look at the Renaissance, for example, it's completely chock full of ideas of eternal truth, and truth is the handmaiden of theology, and the virtues, paintings of the virtues as beautiful women in flowing robes. So I think that it needed a lot of people say like World War I helped start it, because World War I shook a lot of people out of their sort of positive worldview. People before World War I thought we might be heading on, we might be on the way towards a utopia, and World War I kind of convinced a lot of people that there was something deeply wrong. And I think the second wing of it might be feminism, and I think that tended to be what motivated a lot of the students. So a lot of the students would have a very political, very personal attachment to feminism, where I think they saw that as the thing that gave them meaning, the thing that gave them purpose. And so then you just take that presupposition and you bring that into art. So if your worldview is the personal is political, feminism is the secret to bringing about heaven on earth and world peace, then that would just be what would motivate their art. So I would see, really bizarre art projects every day. Gavin McGinnis, pardon the illustration, but Gavin McGinnis likes to joke about how a lot of postmodern art is a tampon in a teacup. And I would literally see really bizarre examples like that every single day, where it would be like, I remember one girl locking herself in a cage, and she'd written like words or something. This was supposed to be her representation of, the feeling of being under patriarchy. And she's just sitting in the hall in her cage, and the music students would be there too, and they just walk around her. That was the kind of thing I was used to seeing every day. But the readings would be to try to explain the intellectual side of it. So we might read. I remember Lacan. So he was this French philosopher. He wrote very, very difficult essays. But the idea of reading Lacan was to say, well, the identity is not true. It's not concrete. It could be anything. So if your identity could be anything, if truth could be anything, then you can make art that is, waving around or going crazy, or you pretty much do anything. That's how I'd sum it up.
So, out of curiosity, how would they justify this as being true art? Because, as I mentioned in the pre-show, I'm an art Philistine. My major was in neuroscience. So, when I see what would be classified as postmodern art, what I see is a lot of junk that doesn't really have any talent or skill, or doesn't require any talent or skill to produce. So how do they justify that as actual art that should be installed in museums and that people should create?
I think they start by telling a story. So they tell the story of the oppression of women, and they might talk about Artemisia Gentileschi. She was a beautiful painter, a very talented female painter, little younger than Caravaggio. So what would that be? Late 1600s, early 1700s. So Artemisia Gentileschi accused another painter of raping her, and there was a big trial about it. And I think they decided there was insufficient evidence to convict the man. And then Gentileschi would paint things like Judith slaying Holofernes, so the Jewish woman cutting off the head of the pagan king, or she'd paint herself as the personification of painting. So feminists will look at something like that, and instead of saying, let's talk about how beautifully Gentileschi paints, they'll say, well, let's look about how this symbolizes her anger at the patriarchy, her anger at men. And then they'll carry that into the 20th century and say that feminism was the thing that was needed to rebel against the patriarchy. The patriarchy loves things like objective beauty and skill. I think Linda Nochlin might be a good feminist scholar to look at. Her famous essay that they use in a lot of the 101 classes is called "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" And her argument is that artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo get to be great artists because they were the beneficiaries of a patriarchal system. Therefore, what is needed is feminists can't just say we need more women artists. They need to deconstruct the entire history of Western art and replace it with a new theory of art that will allow women to succeed and allow women to overcome patriarchy. That's basically how I understand why they want to make ugly art, is they see beautiful art or skilled art as something which has contributed to the oppression of women.
So basically the justification comes down to their view of art history as one that has held female artists down.
Right. So I guess Gentileschi is a good example of like a female artist being held down. They pretty much assert that because patriarchy has held back women, in economics, in the field of science, it holds back women in the field of art like it does in everything. Therefore, we need to get rid of it and replace it with a new system.
So then the question becomes, as those of us who are skeptical of this story, how do you counter that?
It's tough because maybe this is where comic books kind of comes in, because they will talk about popular culture. I remember we had a presentation on the mattress girl thing months and months before that hit the mainstream news, because to every art professor, this was like the most chic, cool thing ever. Like, hey kids, look at this girl. She's carrying a mattress around as an act of performance art to protest rape culture on her campus. And so I literally see professors kind of like introduce the slides and the little stories on this art student, and then they encourage students to think that way for their own art, to take inspiration for that. And then months and months pass, and then, you know, like Sargon of Akkad starts covering it. You know, people start poking holes in her story, but there was a good chunk of time where the mattress girl was the chic thing on campus. I'm sorry. I went off on a bit of one of my legendary tangents there. Could you refresh me?
Yeah, Summa Tantatum. I was asking how do we counter that the traditional view of art as making things that are beautiful, things that uplift, things that inspire, is in fact patriarchal oppression? How do we counter?
I guess that's one of the focuses of my channel that I'm trying to accomplish. I think one problem is if that becomes your worldview, if fighting the patriarchy becomes everything that defines you, when you argue against it, you're not just arguing against a neutral idea, you're arguing against the equivalent of a religion that gives them purpose, that gives them a lens through which to look at the world. It gives them hope. You may have seen my video talking about the documentary War, you know, Women, Art, Revolution. And some of these feminist artists would say that, you know, every fiber of their being was devoted to the feminist struggle and making the avant-garde feminist art the new norm in art institutions. So I don't know, the problem is I don't think a logical argument can cut through that, because at that point they've made it sort of the bedrock of everything they build their world on. And, you know, this is kind of where things like, you know, first truths and theology gets in, because for a lot of people, like, belief in God is one of their first truths. That's one of the things that guides them through their entire life. So I think that's what makes it tough, is this is a culture war where we're disagreeing with them about some really fundamental questions about the way life works. So one of my solutions has been, well, okay, look at what they actually produce. So I think there are a good chunk of people who are moderate feminists. You know, they follow it because they think it, you know, it sounds nice. It sounds like, oh, this is for helping women. Well, boy, I want to help women. That sounds great. But then you ask them about like the nutty Marxist stuff, and they don't want anything to do with that. You know, I have to believe that if you took a good chunk of, you know, Democrats or center leftists on planet Earth and you brought them into one of these weird avant-garde classes, they would think it's nuts too. And I think the problem is trying to communicate to people how nutty this worldview is and how it leads people to, I think, celebrate ugliness and make ugliness and trash the new culture.
Yeah, I may be an art Philistine, but that is kind of the impression that I get when things trickle down about things that have been installed in art museums, like toilets and like that. It's like, how is that art? How did that take any time or skill to make? Like
to play the devil's advocate, because I love doing that with social justice. So I think they look at it as this is the new intellectual art. So, you know, photography took away what the painter used to be. You used to hire a painter to paint your family portrait. With photography, you don't need a painter to do that anymore. So there had to be some new role for the artist. And one thing I'd like to do is I'd kind of like to see, I think because a lot of conservatives aren't particularly interested in the arts, they're interested in politics and history and philosophy. Yeah. There's a dearth of anyone who's centrist or right of center talking about 20th century art. So I've always thought it'd be nice for people who want to kind of redeem the left or to fix the problems they see coming from the radical social justice left to take a good hard look at what the culture they've produced and think about it, because maybe one way to think about it is, yeah, they produce a lot of trash, but another way to think about it is they tend to be at the forefront of everything. So before anyone's thinking about YouTube videos, there are weird avant-garde artists making experimental video art, and they're learning how to do, experimental, strange cutting techniques and video techniques, right? So they make a lot of weird art, but because they're constantly experimenting and constantly trying out new things with the latest technology, they also tend to be the ones making the most culture. And then when they want to make something that means something, they draw on their worldview. And if their worldview says patriarchy is evil, then they're going to make art. And, whether it's avant-garde video art or it's a little comic on Tumblr, they're going to make art that reflects what they think is true about the world.
Well, I think that's true of everyone. The authors that I am close to and follow and read, their work is also influenced by their worldview. I think that's unavoidable. So I understand it on that level. And I'm not someone that is willing to dismiss all 20th century art. I think there is a lot of 20th century art that is quite beautiful. I don't think you have to be married to realism or even to traditional styles of painting to create beautiful art. I don't think that's true. But I think that I feel like in art, beauty should still be the lodestone.
I agree. I think that's a great way of looking at it, because you could actually take inspiration from someone you disagree with, or someone who you have a very different perspective from art from. I don't know if I've told the story, but one of my favorites I discovered is it was a radical leftist group, but they were making interesting paintings. They were doing Jackson Pollock paintings that were actually optical illusions. So you'd look at it and it looks like a bunch of splatters, but then you step away from it and it becomes a portrait. So it'd become a portrait of Lenin or a portrait of something else. And they meant it to be some sort of, cerebral, oh, I've got a great, personal essay to explain what this means. I just thought it was cool that they were so good at deceiving people. It looks like a splatter until you step away, and boom, then you see a portrait, and it's a cool looking portrait. So that's always been my little anecdote I've told to young artists that I've worked with, that don't be too quick to dismiss anything. Look at it as something you can learn from, and once you do that, then you can even read like really silly novels and really bad manga and still learn as you do it, because you're getting information on, well, if there's anything good about this, what's the good thing? If there's something dumb about this, why is it dumb, and how could I avoid that?
Yeah. And actually, during the sad puppies thing that I mentioned in the pre-show, I read stories and books that were favored by the other side.
Yeah.
And I actually did try to find things that were praiseworthy about them. Like way back, a little bit before Sad Puppies, actually, I started paying the supporting membership to become a Hugo voter. And in 1 year back then, N.K. Jemison's, one of N.K. Jemison's books was up for the Novel Award.
Yeah.
And I read it. And when I did the review on my blog way back when, it was like 2011, 2012, something like that, I said, this doesn't really appeal to me, but it does have some signs of craft in it. Like,
yeah,
I really did try to be fair to a lot of the product that was coming out from the other side. And I think it is important to do that. I'm not sure that we're getting the same respect in return. I think the authors on our side are definitely not getting that same courtesy that I have tried to show that side. But
there's a theologian I follow who will sometimes say, when he interacts with theologians on the far left, he notices that he's read their books, but they don't read his books, or they don't read the books of their theologian colleagues on the right. I think there's this assumption that the intelligentsia is left. The arc of history bends leftward. Therefore, why do we need to waste time, exploring the idiotic ideas of those two are right. I don't know who it was. There's some intellectual who made famous the quote that he thought conservatism wasn't an ideology or a philosophy. He thought conservatism was just a bunch of irritable mental gestures. And that I've noticed that tendency all my life. I was really interested in politics even before I went into art school. I was just kind of casually interested in it. And there's always been this tendency to say that, now maybe the thing is, I don't want to be too quick, right? The right might be guilty of this too, but there's this tendency for the left to say it's not just the right are wrong, the right are evil, they're pathological, they're motivated by fear and hatred. And for a while, I just kind of like read about these debates. I'd be kind of interested in these debates, but it wasn't until I was in school and I was sort of with these people, learning under these people, listening to these people talk all the time, that I kind of realized, oh, this is like a real thing. It's not just a few weirdos in a blue state over there. There's like a real movement here, and they're really, really committed to these ideas. So even though there are some weird aspects to my time in SGW art school, I'd still say it was a learning experience for me, where I kind of like became aware that this is significant and it's really worth talking about because it's an important part of our culture.
And as someone who didn't really buy into it, how were you able to navigate that space when so many people were convinced of it?
Ben Shapiro likes to say, keep your head down and get the A. So I tried to keep my head down, and I would read the Marxist essay. I'd write a great essay on the Marxist essay, and I'd get 100% on the anarcho-feminist Marxist essay on art that we were assigned. And for a while, I kind of felt bad about it because I always felt I was just masking or hiding what I really thought. If I ever raised an objection, I would try to couch that objection as, well, someone might argue this. What would you say to this imaginary person I've just made up? And that's
it's some imaginary person I'm dreaming up right now.
Imagine if someone argued that it's wrong to compare cultural appropriation to genocide. How would you respond to that? And then the person would say, well, that's their white privilege talking. Oh, okay. I wonder who would possibly say that then. But, which is an important part of why I made my channel. Is I survive SGW art school. I come out of it and I kind of feel depressed. Like, what did I just do? Did I really just? Thankfully, I got really good scholarships, so I did not want to go into debt to do this. But I wonder, did I just do the thing that I make fun of other people for? Like, they go to one of these weird art schools, they come out not knowing how to make art, and all they know is how to do Starbucks. Or did I come out of that with something useful? And what I realized I came out of it with is I know what these people talk about when they don't think anyone else is there. When they don't think anyone else is there, they are perfectly happy to let the mask slip and talk about the Antifa tactics, or talk about how they really wish they could go out there and beat up those pro-life protesters who are visiting the campus, or how they sincerely believe they want to destroy all institutions and they want to teach their freshman students how to do that. And when you hear that, it's like being a fly on the wall, where they believe they're talking about the things that they would never say in public. They don't want anyone else to talk about because they believe they're surrounded by like-minded people. And when you get to hear that, then you come away from that. Like, I'm never going to be impressed by people who say, oh, cultural Marxism, that's just a conspiracy theory. There's not a problem on our campuses, because I was in the classroom. I heard what my teachers said, and no one's ever going to convince me that they didn't say what I heard them say.
Yeah.
And I guess I pointed that, so my channel was sort of me like feeling frustrated, not knowing what to do. So I just grabbed my phone. I was inspired by the Diversity in Comics channel. I just started talking about The Legend of Zelda, because I'm a Legend of Zelda nerd. And I kind of put two and two together, that the things I love about The Legend of Zelda, social justice hates about The Legend of Zelda. Therefore, I can't not talk about it, because it's not going to leave my hobbies alone. Like, I like comics, I like manga, I like video games. It's eventually going to railroad all of this unless we start talking about these issues and shining a light on these topics. I'm really glad that you've done this in science fiction. I'm glad that you've worked in your field to think about some of these things, because we kind of need all hands on decks in multiple fields.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's basically everywhere. I have had acquaintances of mine in social media talk about how their knitting groups are being taken over.
Oh, I could have told you that from, yes, we read about this in art history. They would assign us these, like, feminist knitting essays, and the idea is they would like tell you this history about how women's, but sewing was also a revolutionary act of women gaining economic power, and how you should go to the Baptist sewing circles and bring your politics there to weaponize it. It's called craftivism. Like, and this would, like, you'll see memes of this on Tumblr. Like, it'll be like a little sewing kit. I don't know that much about sewing, and it'll say something like kill all men, or something nasty like that.
Oh, jeez. Yeah. So that actually turns out to be a real thing, and not just the knitting group on Facebook.
Yep.
People are actually attempting to take over knitting.
Yeah. Okay. You're familiar with Sargon of Akkad and Gamergate, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I stopped playing video games when I was a student because I figured I got to be a good student. So the first I hear about it is my art professors talking about this Gamergate thing and how this is a misogynist attack on women in games. And since I already am distrustful and suspicious of what they have to say, I say, okay, whatever this is, I bet it's not that. I bet that's not an accurate description of what's going on. So I discover sort of the first generation of Gamergate YouTubers, like Sargon of Akkad. And that was kind of my introduction to this idea that, hey, YouTube's not just a place for cat videos. You can dive into some of this stuff. And like Sargon of Akkad, I have significant disagreements with him. He's got his faults. I think Mr. Medicare did a really good job memeing the poor guy, but I think he's always been right about his emphasis on feminism. So he tends to see feminism as the motivation behind why Gamergate happened, and he eventually stopped talking about Gamergate, and he moved on to talking about the big idea which caused it, which I thought was admirable. So when I made a channel, I kind of had that in mind, that more important than this pro said something bad about Comicsgate, what might be more important is why did they say that? How do they see the world that makes them think that it's okay to call fans a bunch of misogynists? Yeah.
Yeah, and by the same token, I started following the Gamergate channels, and I started following the Comicsgate channels because, as I mentioned in the pre-show, I saw Comicsgate, Gamergate, and Sad Puppies. They rhyme.
Yeah.
All three of those movements, they're in different fandoms, and contrary to popular belief, there isn't a whole lot of overlap. I mean, I think the only Gamergate guy that was really involved in Sad Puppies was Daddy Warpig. But of course, when Sad Puppies was going on, the other side was going on about how, oh, it's just Gamergaters trying to infiltrate science fiction.
Right.
I really didn't see a whole lot of overlap there, but the themes are the same.
Yeah.
And,
it's like different fandoms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's different fandoms, but it's the same theme, which is you have one side that are basically the what I would call the traditional audience, or the longtime fans that have been around for a while, and then you have basically the upstarts that are coming in and trying to change what the fandom was before. And so the three movements are basically the traditional longtime fans saying, whoa, wait a second. If you really love this, why are you trying to change it into something it's not? With comics and science fiction, I've always viewed them, they are supposed to be popular, they're supposed to be for the masses, and make it highbrow, like high literature or something like that is a fool's errand, because that's not what they're supposed to be. They're supposed to be consumed by popular audiences. But like in the science fiction field, we have a lot of people that that denigrate the old popular science fiction because, oh, you know, it's dumb and lowbrow, and all it is white men and rocket ships, which, by the way, is not an accurate description of the history of science fiction.
Yeah.
But it's a topic for another day. And they say about us that we don't want anything different, we don't want anything creative, we just want the same old thing over and over again. And that's not true either. And well, once Comicsgate rolled around, I saw the same themes cropping up again. I started following the Comicsgate channels because when people are saying that X fan of comics is a misogynist, just like you in our school, I immediately distrust it because I've been through this rodeo before, you know? Yeah. So I go and I look into it and I say, yeah, no, it's the same popular revolt against this attempt to take something that is popular, that has appeal for a mass audience, and to make it something other than that.
Yeah.
And that's the real problem.
Now, since you had your finger on the pulse of this field, let me throw something at you and see if this speaks to you. So one of the interesting things to me about all of the comics discussion is someone will say superheroes have always been social justice warriors. So if you like Captain America and you're on the right, well, what's wrong with you? Don't you know that he hates Nazis and he punches Nazis? And the X-Men were gay. They've always been social justice warriors. But then they will also have these, there will be feminist blogs writing these long pieces about how this is problematic and this is sexist and this appeals to the male gaze. And it seems to me like they must have cognitive dissonance. Like, how can you say, on one hand, there's all this problematic stuff we got to fix from the history of comics, and on the other hand, they've always been progressive? And my theory is they want power, and they're afraid if they say Captain America wasn't an SJW, they're afraid that that'll be ceding ground to the right. Do you see something like that in science fiction, where there's this attitude to say all these science fiction writers were sexist, misogynist, and there's this attitude that says if you're on the right and you like science fiction, well, you're stupid. You must never have read all these great progressive social justice warrior science fiction classics. Have you seen something like that?
Absolutely, the exact same thing. And my response to that, which I've occasionally tweeted about, is like, we'll have people on the other side say, you know, oh, why are these sad puppies talking about how much they love Star Trek? Don't they know how leftist Star Trek is?
Yeah.
And my response is, yeah, I know it's leftist. I know it's secular humanist. That's obvious. Like, the way that the setting is set up, that is what it is.
Yeah.
But the difference between Star Trek and what's coming out now from the left side of fandom is that Star Trek at least paid attention to good storytelling and the crafting of good characters. And in at least some of the franchises didn't always stick to the leftist script.
Yeah.
You know, and sometimes they would just have, I mean, Diversity in Comics says it about comics. Yeah, there were the political comics, but then there was also the simple adventures where, you know, the staff of the Enterprise would encounter X space anomaly of the week and have to find some way to get out of it, and it had no politics in it whatsoever.
Yeah,
that's the difference. And I also think that I've also tweeted about how I perceive a change in progressivism between the progressivism of mid-century, when modern day science fiction was really defined kind of in the mid-20th century, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely arguments for saying that it started with Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, but modern sci-fi as we know it was really a 20th century thing.
Yeah.
And And progressivism back then, I think, was a completely different animal. I feel like when you have Isaac Asimov, who was very leftist and very progressive, saying that he can be friends with Poul Anderson even though Poul Anderson was conservative,
Yeah.
that's a different kind of progressivism than the progressivism we have today. So that annoys the crap out of me, actually, when people say, well, science fiction has always been SJW, or superheroes have always been SJW. I'm like, you don't understand what we mean when we say SJW. We're not talking about just generally leftists. We're talking about the type of leftist that uses, what was it, Connor Friesdorf came up with the idea of the idioms of non-argument.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that, but I know the basically what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. They don't try to argue for their leftism. They just try to vilify the other side. That's what we mean by SJW. I have a sister-in-law who's a center-left Democrat. I love her dearly. She's wonderful. She's a great person. She is not an SJW.
Yeah. I have friends who were far left Bernie supporters, and they hated the speech police political correctness thing because they wanted to have a risque sense of humor, or they wanted to enjoy, risque art. It's hard for you to, I don't know, like the sexual revolution and everything that came from it, and like the sex negative aspect of feminism that seems to be kind of like waving its finger at even like innocuous, even completely sexually innocuous stuff has been argued to be a part of male gaze theory. My favorite I've ever found in reading art is someone argued a painting of the Virgin Mary completely wrapped in clothing was an example of male gaze because she had a pretty face.
Wow. That's pretty amazing, yeah. To turn to sort of things that are currently going on in popular culture, I sent you the tweets about the female celebrities talking about how terrible the Disney princesses are. Yeah, did you get a chance to read those?
I read both. And did you see my video I did on Cinderella a while ago? It was probably a few months ago.
Cinderella, the Badass Ninja? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Because I remember reading Grimm's fairy tales in high school, and I probably had the same impression most kids did. Wow, these have a lot more violent details than the Disney movies. But a lot of them are strange, and a lot of them are really interesting because there will be these repeating motifs, or you won't quite get what's going on or what's going through the characters' heads. And I love that kind of story because I think it's kind of like you're getting a window into what the most primal or basic types of stories are before we started getting more and more sophisticated in what we wanted. And I think if you can understand like the basics of what a story is, that makes it easier for you to appreciate the bigger, the more complex ones. And I definitely think that again, when I was in high school, I first started to hear the Cinderella is sexist argument. And this is an example where I think you can't be like too quick to dismiss feminists, because it could be right that a kid could look at Cinderella and say, oh, okay, so what I'm supposed to do is just wait around for someone to come and rescue me. But I think that's ignoring context. It's ignoring what the point of the story is. If you read the story and you try to say, why would someone tell this story to their child? Then it sort of dawns on you that there's actually a good point here. The point is, don't give up, don't despair and be hopeless and think your life's always going to suck. And I think that when you're looking to change what gender is, if you're looking to change what the culture is, you kind of have to define yourself against what's come before. And fairy tales are a good thing to use as as a straw man, or as an example of something you want to resist against. Now you're in literature, so I'm sure that you've probably come across more of this than I have in the field of art. But the feeling I get is that the intersectional feminist left, especially, I don't believe it's possible to tell a story that isn't problematic if you could just, as long as you look hard enough for something problematic, you'll find it. What's your experience in that, in fiction?
Yes. I mean, in fiction, what we have now is we have the movement by the social justice and sectional left to basically set aside the legacies of the establishing authors in our field. So, for example, H.P. Lovecraft. Yes, he was a racist. That's undeniable. But the problem is he had such a profound effect on at least the horror side of the genre that just setting him aside and saying, oh, we don't care about that, we don't need to read him, we don't need to appreciate what he did. I think that your view of the field then becomes very, very narrow when you do that. And you lose a lot, because there was a lot to his craft that actually had a tremendous impact on the field. And same with someone on the more hard sci-fi end, like Robert Heinlein. A lot of people have been taking taunts to Robert Heinlein's reputation because he basically evolved to be a libertarian. And of course the social justice that, and they think he's a terrible racist, sexist, and fascist, and go on and on and on with that. And even if all of that were true, which actually in Heinlein's case I don't think that's true. I think that for his time he was actually quite progressive when it came to his view of women, and when it came to his view of people who were not white. I think that he was the very model of a mid-century not racist.
Yeah.
But people are trying to read these past figures in the field through today's lens, instead of recognizing that people who lived in history aren't going to know what people think today. So obviously they're not going to have all the same mores.
Right, which is true of most of the founders of feminism. Most of the founders of feminism have views that would today get labeled racist. But one thing to consider is what did they have access to at that time? So I'm reading Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and in some ways it's kind of fun to read her, because she would make arguments for state rights, or she'd make arguments for like we want liberty, and we want we want the principles of the Constitution to be upheld. And I'm saying, all right. And then she'd also get into like some weird eugenics stuff. And what you realize is she believed that science was creating a utopia. And one of the things that science was going to do to create a utopia was it was going to eliminate the bad genes out of society. Where did they think all the bad genes were? Yeah. So history's messy. And I think to their credit, like some of the feminists I've been reading, what's her name? Estelle Friedman. So Estelle Friedman does this sort of lecture on Feminism 101, and she's forced to acknowledge that there's a socialist stream of feminism. There's a racist stream in some of the early suffragette movements. History's complicated, and the more you think about it, I'm a Christian, so I believe there are absolute moral truths. So I don't abandon that, but you do abandon like trying to simplify people in history into good guys and bad guys. I don't think you can make that work.
Well, I think it's unfair to expect people who did not have access to whatever today's conversation is to behave according to that conversation.
Right. We're taking our values and our ideas, and we're trying to project them backwards. And this is true in history, and I think this is even true in fiction. It drives me nuts when the characters will look like they're in a medieval fantasy setting, but they talk like millennials, because that doesn't fit. If you're going to tell a story in that setting, try to acknowledge that people in that kind of world might have a very different perspective than we would today. And trying to think. I guess I'm imagining that would apply in science fiction too. Like I'm not expecting alien societies. It might be funny if there was an alien society that had kind of a social justice style vision of the world, but I'm guessing that most alien societies, a lot of them would probably have very racist views of the world, or they'd have very, religious absolutist views of the world. That's one of the exciting things about science fiction is, hey, let's imagine some crazy world where some things are like our world, but some things are very different.
Yeah. I just got finished watching the first season of The Orville, and that's actually one thing that Seth MacFarlane did pretty well. Was he had the robot character Isaac was racist. Like he believed that his race of artificial beings was superior to all biological life, and made no bones about that. Like, yeah. And yeah, in the very first pilot episode, the captain, played by Seth MacFarlane, is like, wait, why is there a Kalon here? Aren't you guys notorious for being racist? Like, yeah, so he did a good job acknowledging that certain societies, that alien societies that are not our society, would have very different and possibly, quote unquote, problematic perspectives.
Right.
He also did that with the Mocklins, who are very, very sexist. So, yeah. And there was a whole episode involving that that actually dealt with the transgender issue, I think, in a very smart way. So, if you haven't watched that might be something you might be interested in watching.
Yeah. Do you have thoughts on Steven Universe as an example of sci-fi?
I have not watched Steven Universe.
All right. I haven't. I've only watched like one episode of it, and I'm kind of interested because people tend to present that as like the good social justice show, where it actually has some decent qualities, but it clearly has a social justice aspect to the way the alien races are agendered, but they look like women, so the implication is, oh, they're lesbians without being lesbians. That kind of a thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I have heard that about Steven Universe as well, and have thought about possibly watching it to see if it really is an example of the good social justice. Because I think, I really want to believe that you can have a far left mind space and write a good story.
Yeah.
I really want to believe that's possible. I haven't seen it happen yet, but
another way of putting it is maybe if you have that, you're able to separate that from your creative self. Because my view of history is it seems to be that most of the people who are inclined to be artists in the first place tend to lean left. So it's kind of weird to be, far right and really interested in the arts. Like I feel like a real weirdo for being this way. But
yeah, if you have a creative temperament, it does tend to lean you left. That's always been true. Yeah, and science fiction fandom has always leaned left.
Yeah.
Ever since I've been in it, I've noticed that leftward lean. But there's a difference. Like I said before, there's a difference between that, having a clear leftward lean, and having that hostile, bullying sort of a leftism that we're seeing now.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention, because as part of my show prep, I watched the 1937 Snow White this afternoon.
Oh, sweet! Oh, I love this 1937 Snow White. Okay, tell me what you took away from it from rewatching it.
What I took away from it is that the men, or the men as represented by the dwarfs,
yeah,
were presented as goofy and flawed and needing of a woman's presence in order to straighten them out, and I thought that was that's an I see that as a counter narrative to the idea that Snow White is sexist in some way.
Yeah,
because I think that what it really is women have their strengths, men have their strengths, they belong together, right. And without a woman man becomes uncivilized and doesn't clean his house, right? And without a man, a woman uh, uh, has trouble finding her purpose in life, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it is so, what the celebrities are saying about it. They obviously don't understand the story at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think NPCs, the NPC me.
Yeah.
I think a tendency of what people mean when they talk about the NPC is there's a kind of person who kind of stubbornly doesn't want to look at context. They have a thing they want to say. They want that to be the dominant view. So they kind of stubbornly repeat it. Like if maybe through repetition, I can make people think this way. And I think if you're looking for, this story's bad, this story will make my child sexist, well, then you're going to find it. But if you look for the good in Snow White, I think it's really good to not just watch a movie with a child, but then ask them questions about what they think about it, and not try to lead the child into thinking exactly as you think. But what is it? We don't teach children. It's Thomas Sowell. The problem is we don't teach children how to think. We're teaching them what to think.
Yeah. Asking them leading questions like, don't you think it's weird that the prince kissed her without her consent? Like, you obviously don't understand the Christian underpinnings of the story. Yeah. The prince is Christ.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. And the apple is supposed to be original sin and all that stuff. And also what people have been saying on Twitter. So he was just supposed to lay there in a coma forever.
Yeah. Like someone had to tweet, I don't care if you're a dude, save my black ass.
Yeah, I retweeted that. Yeah. One of the dudes I follow, he's like, yeah, plant a big, wet, sloppy one on me. Use tongue if you need to. Just save my black ass. Yeah.
I gotta rewatch Snow White again, because the last time I read a comic book based on it. I just thought it was okay. It's hard to recapture that raw spark.
Yeah. Yeah. And the talk about how Cinderella just waits around for a prince to rescue her.
Yeah.
In the Disney version, it actually wasn't the prince that rescued her; it was the mice.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. The mice have the most active role in that story, really.
Yeah. And the thing is, these mice were her friends. So in a way, you can argue that Cinderella actually did rescue herself by being the sort of person who could make friends with people that would help her out when she was in a jam.
Yeah. And, Ben Shapiro noticed that she's got some sass in that movie. She's took some person.
Yes. Yeah. So it's not. Yeah. I mean, I was talking to my dad earlier today about that, and basically what they're doing is they're watching the movie and looking for things to complain about instead of taking it as a whole,
Earlier you asked, how can we argue against sort of the feminist narrative? And I think one of the reasons I like Comicsgate, maybe even more than Gamergate, is in Comicsgate, there's more of an opportunity for someone to do something. Like, there are people who make indie games entirely on their own, but the logistics of making a video game are way different than the logistics of making a comic book, right? So there is opportunity to tell your story. And I think that the more beautiful stories that are told, the more good stories that are told, the more we are spreading good information to the people who don't necessarily care about politics that much. They will get their teaching through the fiction that they read. So I want as much good, wholesome, moral fiction as possible, because that consistently makes people, because then when people hear a radical idea, they have to weigh that against everything they've heard before. Like all of these people saying, oh, the X-Men are SJW, right? Well, Magneto is a violent terrorist. Magneto is someone who believes he is oppressed by a a majority that's in power, and he thinks he's therefore justified in killing people and creating a new society for mutants. All right, that's the Antifa playbook. So if you embrace the Antifa playbook, you have to ignore all the stories from your life and your childhood that are about the bad guy wanting to do a good thing, but being willing to kill people to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, and Magneto is supposed to be the antagonist in that. Yeah. So yes, it is in fact the case that the X-Men were meant to represent minorities.
Yeah.
But
Stan Lee once described them as a Christ metaphor too. They're the people who are attacked, but on behalf of humanity, fight anyway.
Yeah. But you know, the message that you actually get from the old stories is not that if you're an oppressed minority, it's okay to kill and be revolutionary to get what you want. Like,
yeah,
yeah. So
I saw this explicitly discussed in a '90s X Factor book. Now it was kind of like a weird thing where it was Multiple Man, right? So Multiple Man was debating with himself, but one of the arguments he was having with himself was that he did not want his identity to be used to turn him into a victim. He said the problem with people joining these mutant cults is they're letting people use victimhood to convince them to give up all their money. I just said, oh my gosh, that's anti-identity politics. This was a consistent, continual thing in early '90s books that were appreciated by left, right, and center. That used to be a shared principle for a lot of people.
Yeah. And when you look at '90s sci-fi, like I'm almost done with a rewatch of Babylon 5.
Oh, I love Babylon 5.
The quintessential '90s sci-fi. Like one of the heart of the show, in my opinion, is Jakar and Londo and their transformation. And the thing about Jakar is that he has a legitimate grievance. Yeah. Oh goodness, does he have a legitimate grievance? But the whole moral of the story is not. Therefore, it is okay to take revenge on the people who have oppressed you. And that people in the '90s, I distinctly remember people left, right, and center love that about this.
I think Jakar might be partially, not like this is the whole of his character, but I think that the Apostle Paul was probably a partial inspiration for Jakar, because at first he's so full of hate, and then there's this complete transformation in his worldview. It's like Paul going from I want to kill Christians to I must fight for the Church of Christ. It's that radical a transformation in his character.
Yeah. And that's a whole nother video I can do too, because I see a lot of Christian influence in Babylon 5. Now, today Michael Straczynski is himself a self-declared atheist, so I'm sure it was accidental. I'm sure it just came from the cultural truth that he was raised in, but all the same. And yeah, Jakar being the Apostle Paul is one of those influences. Well, there's also moments where Jakar becomes Christ for a bit too.
Right.
And when he's being tortured by the Centauri Emperor,
it's like you can't.
It's like notes in that.
You can't help but allude to that or draw from that if you want to tell a story about the heroic sacrifice, right? Yeah. And George Martin does this. George Martin is explicitly an atheist. I think you can explicitly see him discussing his atheism in the context of his books. But then he'll also have moments that seem like they are theistic moments in his atheist universe. I guess I won't spoil it, but there's a moment where a girl sings a hymn, and it's sort of like this speaks to the man's conscience, and he could have killed her or raped her, but the act of singing that hymn speaks to his soul, right? So that Martin has moments where beauty shines through even though the tenor of his books is it's this, overbearing, sad, murderous universe that's based on the War of the Roses. Yep. And I think good writers can't help it, because the atheist story, we're all atoms, we're all going to die, and none of this will have mattered. Well, that's not an exciting story. So if you want to tell an exciting story as an atheist, you have to mine from other worldviews, I think, to make it work.
Yeah, author John C. Wright said that exactly. He, in one of his quotes a while back, he came a line like, atheism can't tell good stories. Atheists have to borrow from other universes. And he says, because, if you're an atheist, I dare you to write an inspiring story about the inevitable heat death of the universe.
Yeah.
You just can't do it. You have to mine things from the actual tradition of our society to really make a story go. Well, with that is the end of our hour.
All right.
I have enjoyed this conversation with you, and maybe sometime in the future we can do it again.
It's a blast, definitely. Or I could have you on next time. That'd be fun too.
Oh yeah, that would be great fun. You can pepper me with more questions about the sci-fi field.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for having me on. Look forward to the next chat.
You're welcome. And thank you for the few viewers that managed to make it over here, even though Uncle Ethan is streaming at the same time. I'm glad that you came here to watch us live. This is the Right Geek signing off.